Welcome back to another edition of the Heart to Heart podcast. And my guest today is Dr. Jaime Seeman, also known as Dr. Fit and Fabulous on Instagram. She was an OBGYN surgeon. She was in the NBC Titan Games. She was Miss Nebraska in 2020. And she's also the host of the Fit and Fabulous podcast. So Dr. Jaime Seeman, welcome to the show.
It's so great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, I have a lot that I want to chat with you about today, a lot of questions I have to ask you. But before we kind of get into those questions, can you just give the audience a little bit of a brief background about yourself?
Yeah. So I'm in Omaha, Nebraska, and I am a full-time practicing OBGYN. So I deliver babies, I do surgery, I take care of women all the way from teenage girls to really old gals. And but I have a little bit of a background that kind of probably brought me to where I am today on this podcast. So I grew up as an athlete playing tons of sports. My dad was a collegiate football player and played professionally for a short stint. And I've always loved being an athlete and competing. But as a kid, you're very resilient to lifestyle choices, and nothing against my parents, but I never really focused on nutrition. I ate a lot of fast food as a kid, a lot of hamburger helper without the hamburger. And I went off to college. I played collegiate softball for Nebraska and was getting a degree in nutrition and exercise science. I mean, I loved it so much that I thought if I don't go into medicine, then I'm going to do something, in the sports and exercise world. And that was kind of the first time in my life where there was any sort of focus on nutrition. So I'm getting my degree and it's very like DASH diet, Mediterranean diet, eat low fat, that, fat causes heart disease. And, but I was a traditional college kid, started like drinking beer and eating Taco Bell at 3 a.m. But after I graduated from the university and went to medical school, I met my husband in college, we got married. And this was this sudden shift for me from going from being, I don't want to say forced to working out. I mean, I was a 2-time lifter of the year, but on a lot of levels, like I didn't want to lift weights anymore. As a woman, I wanted to be like thin again. I was watching all these, the world, like I always joke, like it was like the 90s cocaine model. Like that's what you were sold like day in and day out. So to be an athlete with like quads and shoulders and things like that, it didn't feel right. So went to medical school. I was sitting on my tail for like long periods of time in the library, studying for tests every Saturday. And it was the first time I started to struggle with my own weight. And all I knew was count calories. So I was literally keeping like this little paper pencil log. I was like counting goldfish crackers while I'm studying. And I had my first pregnancy.
Aren't good for you.
I mean, but a serving is 50 and I counted out 50. Okay. Yeah. It's just fun. I mean, this is why the whole story is funny. Like I'm getting a medical degree, right? And I'm eating goldfish crackers. So, I had my first pregnancy in medical school and then ended up having 2 babies during residency. And during my pregnancies, I failed my glucose testing. I was diagnosed with hypothyroidism. And then after I got out into private practice, I was really just running. I was trying to lose the baby weight by running half marathons. I had stopped lifting weights completely. And I was metabolically just a total wreck. And I felt like a fraud because I thought, holy crap, like I have a medical degree, I have a nutrition and exercise science degree. Like if anybody should know what to do, it should be me, right? And we tell patients this all the time, like lifestyle intervention is like the number one intervention for everything. So I just decided and made that decision that I lost one of my best friends that year. And that was just this kind of revelation for me of, life is short and I'm taking it for granted. So I went back and I went back and did fellowship. I got an integrative medicine fellowship completed, did a lot of like additional training, completely shifted the way I practice medicine, completely shifted my own life. And it really put me on an entire new trajectory. And that's where Dr. Fit and Fabulous was born.
That's awesome. So I imagine you made, a lot of nutrition changes, and I kind of have not the same background as you, but similar. So I actually did a degree in nutrition as well before I did medical school, and I think had sort of the same experience with a lot of the professors. Like they weren't necessarily fit themselves by any means, but they were teaching nutrition. And then the big thing was I still remember the class where they, talked about protein requirements. And it was, the very typical, 0.36 grams of protein per kilogram, which is just like, that's just barely enough to like keep you alive.
Abysmal.
Like you are not going to like build any muscle on that. You're not going to be able to maintain any muscle on that. So, I've kind of had the same experience with regards to, like what I learned in medical school or what I learned in nutrition is not, exactly what I like practice, now. And, when I, talk with this, people always say, okay, well, what do you eat like, specifically right now? And so, it's still mostly, a lot of like grass-fed beef, a lot of eggs. I do eat fruits and vegetables. I'm not like afraid of carbs because I'm not super hard gainer, but if I don't eat carbs, sometimes my weight can kind of drop quite a bit. So I need to keep it maybe around 100 or 150 a day. Like I have done the keto thing before, but I just find that for whatever reason, my body needs a little bit of carbs to keep on the muscle. But talking about nutrition, like what were you doing? Oh, I guess you kind of mentioned what you were doing before, which was just, counting calories. So what do you do now
Yeah.
that's kind of different?
Yeah. I mean, I went through years of just count calories, move more, count calories, move more, and it wasn't working. So, when I started to think about, okay, why do I have hypothyroidism? Why did I fail on my glucose testing? Well, I come from a long family history of diabetics, and it was easy to just say, well, this is genetic, this is going to be me. I'm going to just end up like my grandparents and my dad. And I started looking at the medical literature, and I had been told at one point that I had PCOS when I was trying to get pregnant with my first daughter. And with PCOS, they say lose 10% of body weight, right? And
And
but I
and for
started
people
diving
who
back.
don't know, just explain maybe what PCOS is.
Yeah, so PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, horrible name, but basically it's infertility. It's people who are not ovulating regularly. They have hormonal disturbances where they have high androgens like testosterone and DHEA. They have tons of estrogen and a relative lack of progesterone because they're not ovulating. And long term, these patients are at a higher risk for metabolic disease. So it's insulin resistance and infertility is what it is. And so I started getting kind of back into the literature, and I'm like, going back to my nutrition degree, eat fish, eat vegetables, like that sounded awful. Um, so I was like, okay, this makes sense. Like just eat whole foods, right? Cut out all the processed stuff. So I started with Whole30. And I was breastfeeding at the time and saw a little dip in my supply. So I kind of panicked, but honestly, I started to feel better. But it was a lot of work, right? Because
Mhm.
we live in such a processed world. Like I have to make my own ketchup. Like I have to make my own, right? So it was hard. And then I transitioned into more paleo, and I'm like, okay, let's try paleo. I like meat, I like this, I like that. There were some carbs, but the issue is I like cheese. So I was like, I don't think I can stick with paleo because I like cheese. And it was around 2015, 2016. I was kind of starting to hear more about the ketogenic diet. It was kind of making its like big comeback, right, from the last wave when it was Atkins. And I thought, okay, this makes sense. Like you have insulin resistance, take the carbs away, then you won't have a blood sugar problem. So I did it, and it was rapid, like really quickly. I was feeling better. The weight was coming off like very effortlessly. Like the lights were coming back in my brain. My husband did it at the same time. He used to get like pretty significant migraines on a weekly basis. Like his migraines went away, his allergies went away. And I mean, I don't want to sell it as a miracle, but for us, it was at that moment,
Mhm.
like, holy crap. And we were just eating like, a lot of meat, fruits, vegetables, basically like no bread, pasta, sugar, like all the things that, we had in our diet before. And then kind of the evolution of my diet, as I restored insulin sensitivity, got completely off of my thyroid medication, I was able to add some whole food carbs back in. Like now I'll eat sweet potatoes, I'll eat some fruit here and there. I may have a little rice here and there. In 2018, I went very carnivore, kind of just experimenting with the carnivore diet. You kind of touched on this too. I don't think that people need to be in ketosis all the time. I think it's good to dump our glycogen and to restore insulin sensitivity and to teach our body to have dual fuel sources. I think you should understand how to flip that metabolic switch really fast between glucose and ketones. And that's kind of like where I live my life now. I go through periods where I use a little more carbs. I go through periods where I'm, more ketogenic. And for me, I do have a lifetime susceptibility to insulin resistance. Like I've done a lot of like SNP testing of like all the genes, like somewhere in evolution, like your girl loves carbs and she wasn't made to eat carbs. So That's just a sad reality. I've just kind of found my happy place and I've got back into training and lifting weights. And I tell people all the time, like me, hey, if you like carbs, like lift weights, like gain muscle, because muscle is such an amazing reservoir for glycogen and carbs. And long term, if you want to reduce your risk, especially after menopause, you got to have some muscle. So I found my happy place with lifting weights again and moderating carbs and really prioritizing protein and healthy fats.
That's awesome. And I think a lot of people, when they start getting back into, working out, they initially, especially women, I think avoid weight training because they
Mm-hmm.
think that, it's going to make them too big. Like, did you at one point in your life ever feel like, oh, I don't want to do weight training because, it's going to make me too big? And now do you feel like you're kind of encouraging your patients more and more to do weight training because of, all the things that you just mentioned?
Yeah, 10,000%. For me, athletes were men, and I got ridiculed a lot as a younger athlete. And as a woman, I had like quads that were larger than some guys. Like, and, my husband, he's 6'2". He physically weighs, 30 pounds more than me. But it was like always like, I got to stay small because like a potential suitor, like I don't want to act like I'm physically bigger or stronger than like any of these guys. So I always like played small in that regard. And when I left being a college athlete, I was like, dude, I'm not lifting another weight again. Like I cannot wait for these muscles to shrink. And I did. I went through years of like doing like bar and yoga and running half marathons, like thinking that that was going to give me like the body I wanted. And it's just funny because every woman says, like, I don't want to lift weights because I don't want to look like super muscular. I just want to be toned. And it's just like the dumbest thought ever because I will tell you right now to build lean body mass, it takes an incredible amount of work. There is very much a genetic potential when it comes to like your body shape and like where you gain easily and where you don't. Like that's just God's gift. Okay. Um, but getting back into lifting weights, not only does it really help your body composition, but I'll tell you, it really helps your confidence. I mean, I've just never met a woman, a young girl that can throw weights around that isn't just super confident in herself. I think there's just so much to be learned in the gym in that regard of just like doing hard things. And so I have 3 daughters and have really just tried to set an example for them that lifting weights is not masculine. Like it's human. Our bodies were designed to do physically difficult things. I mean, crap. Have you ever watched a woman give birth? Like that is a physical endurance and sprint sport all at the same time. I mean, it's
I think
crazy.
this
So
is a good place to mention that I really liked your Instagram post the other day. It was hilarious. And I think even which episode it was with Joe Rogan, he was saying like, I like him a little bit sturdy. And I
I
remember
like a
him,
woman that can move a couch.
yeah. And I remember him saying, and I completely agree with him. Like if girls get like injected in their ass or they get a fake ass and then they have like skinny like thighs and legs,
Yeah.
it looks super weird. But if a girl like squats and she has a big ass and she has like big thighs, then like that's sexy, So that was what he said. I remember in that
Yeah.
particular podcast.
Yeah.
But when you posted that the other day, that like resonated with me right away. I was like, that's definitely from the same episode I was listening to.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's
I mean,
awesome.
it's so true. I mean, my husband, like, he loves how much I lift. Like, he loves my like athletic build. Like, to him, that is like really sexy. Okay. To some guys, maybe it's not, but like, this is who I am. And I just think that you have to embrace that. And like, health is health. I mean, let's be real. It's just like, it is what it is. And the glorification of, you know, self acceptance and this whole, love people at every size. I'm not against, embracing who you are, but at the same time, like health is health and muscles make you really freaking healthy. So girls move some couches. Okay. And
Yeah,
most men find that very attractive.
they do. They do. So very good point there. I'm happy that we chatted about that. So I do want to get into some women's health topics that I'd like to ask you about because I do prescribe HRT for women. And obviously, I do a little bit of family medicine. So, I get asked by, girls all the time to go on birth control. And so I want to know what your opinion is on birth control. And I saw a podcast with Andrew Huberman and I forget her name, but it's Sarah Gottfried or Gottfried. I'm not
Yeah. 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 Sarah
and,
Gottfried.
And so they mentioned that when you take birth control, women take birth control, there's a decrease in your DHT. And so DHT is dihydrotestosterone, which is actually more powerful than testosterone.
Yep.
So you would think then that women would have, a very difficult time, building muscle, and in some ways even having, motivation and that kind of thing, and also decrease sex drive. But,
Hmm.
the counterpart to that though is I saw a review maybe just 2 or 3 years ago, and it indicated that when women take birth control, I think we're going to get the numbers right. About 20%, I think, had an increase in sex drive, 15% had a decrease, and then the remaining 65 was kind of like neutral overall. So, with all that being said, like, what is your opinion on birth control?
Well, here's the thing. The advent of birth control is amazing because most pregnancies, 50% are even to this day unplanned. So it's great to have these options. The unfortunate part is the, onus of this particularly falls on women a lot, and birth control pills work by stopping ovulation. So you're stopping a natural physiologic process that is supposed to happen every single month for many, many, many years of this woman's life. And you may make the argument, well, yes, she's not trying to get pregnant. So why does this need to happen? But there's trade offs to everything, absolutely everything, right? I have a car. It's amazing that I can drive my car across town to work. Okay, but it emits, I have to burn fuel, I have to burn gas, I have to do maintenance. There is a trade off to everything. And with birth control pills, the trade off is an increased requirement of nutrients. So it can deplete the body of B vitamins, zinc, selenium, magnesium. It increases sex hormone binding globulin, which is how it binds your testosterone, reduces free testosterone, reduces DHT, and the ramifications that can be fatigue. It can be decreased sexual arousal, orgasm, libido. It increases the risk to your bones and your lean body mass in that regard, and your brain for that matter. It increases thyroid binding globulin. So it drags on the thyroid a little bit. So, yes, it's preventing pregnancy, but it does come with side effects. And unfortunately, these really, aren't at the forefront of our counseling when we're talking to patients about this. And all birth control pills contain ethinyl estradiol and then some form of progestin. So when it comes to like the androgenic effect, when you say like a certain percent felt it, a certain percent didn't, that's because some of them contain levonorgestrel. Some of them contain norethindrone acetate. There's newer ones, desogestrel, drospirenone. There's lots of different new progestins that are coming out, and they all have different, effects. But I would say clinically, the vast majority of my patients hate birth control pills. They hate the side effects that come with them. Now, the people that are like, oh, my libido is great, it may be because it's finally a permission to have sex and not like worry about the ramifications of getting pregnant accidentally. There's that too, but there's lots of different options for birth control. And so, it really has to be an individual choice, and people do need to understand that there's always a trade-off.
And so with all that being said, and I mean, obviously, preventing pregnancy is, an amazing thing for people who don't want to get pregnant, right? So, there's quite a bit of benefit there. But with all that being said, if someone does want to go on birth control, is there one that you specifically recommend?
So, a new trend is what we traditionally called like natural family planning or cycle mapping. So women are actually only fertile like one day of the month, like 12 days a year, right? But we spend 365 days making sure we prevent it. And trust me, accidents happen. People get pregnant on birth control pills for that matter. But the issue is that physiologically, the one day of the month that a woman really wants to have sex and have a lot of sexual activity is that day. I mean, there's this natural rise in FSH and LH, estradiol, testosterone. You've got this like amazing, hormonal surge that happens that really put women in that mood to look for a mate and to reproduce. So to say like, okay, well, you're just not allowed to like do anything on that day. Well, that's kind of sad, right? Now you could use barrier methods, you could use withdrawal, you could use other methods. They do tend to be less effective than hormonal birth control, but there's definitely options that don't involve a prescription from your doctor. And then, outside of birth control pills, patches, vaginal rings, all of those contain both estrogen and progesterone. There's progesterone only forms that don't contain estrogen. And the mechanism of action there isn't to inhibit ovulation, but it thickens cervical mucus, decreases tubal motility of the egg and sperm, and then thins the endometrial lining. So they do come with a little less side effects. So there's progesterone only pills, different kinds of them. There's injectable progesterones, which are not my favorite. There's some implantable forms of progesterone like Nexplanon. And then there's progesterone IUDs, which have a little more of a local effect and less of a systemic effect. And then there's a non-hormonal IUD called Paragard, a copper IUD. So there's lots of different forms, and there's some newer ones they're coming out with. There's actually a brand new vaginal gel called Phexxi that's placed intravaginally 30 minutes before intercourse that seems to be rather effective, especially when coupled with, withdrawal. So it just really is, it's up to the patient. It's up to what she, is willing to use because they only work if you use them correctly. And it just depends on her relationship status, There's also permanent forms like tubals and vasectomies. Once again, those comes with trade-offs too, but it's just, these are things that we really have to think about. Kind of what is our end goal and what are we willing to, give and take?
Yeah. And once you're like done with having kids, I mean, I think in many ways it should fall on the man to get the vasectomy as opposed to, a woman getting her tubes tied. It's just like, I mean, it's a 20-minute like office procedure compared to like,
and they've looked at male birth control, and you know what they did? They stopped the trials because men's testosterone got too low. But look at women, right? We just talked about what it does, what birth control pills do to women, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's great when male partners are willing to kind of, step up to the plate and do that kind of thing. I get the scariness of it, but it's the real world. And if you don't want a kid,
yeah. And I mean, I'm kind of
something.
saying that I haven't, had a vasectomy, so I don't know exactly, how bad it is, but I've had lots of friends who do it, and they, they're back to work the same day. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They're back to working out like within a week or a few days. Like it's not something that really hinders like their quality of life like at all.
Yeah.
And also
my husband has had one, and I know he would not care me talking about this. But he did. He had like these irrational fears that like he's not going to be able to get an erection, that orgasm would feel different, sex would feel different, something would be off. I totally understand. But yes, it's an outpatient procedure. It's done under local anesthetic. It's really quick. The recovery is really, minimal. The complications and risks and things like that are low. But yeah, it's some partners are like, I'm not doing that. I mean, because I talk to couples in my clinic, and some are just like not even open to the conversation.
Yeah, well, I think they definitely should be open considering how, benign the procedure is overall. I'm not saying it has no risk, but overall it seems to be like a fairly, benign procedure. So just keeping on the topic of women, I want to talk about menopausal women, but a lot of women premenopausal, they do get, PMS, or they get, very bad symptoms, a lot of bad cramping, bloating, it's not necessarily the whole month, but, certain times of the month. And for a lot of those women, I'm not sure what is the intervention that you use? Like, do you just use like ibuprofen? And I use a little bit of CBD for women. Sometimes that can be helpful. But there's a lot of people now who are using progesterone, and I've used some progesterone a little bit just on, days 15 to 25 for some women, and they found it to be, highly effective. But there's really not too much in the literature on that. Like when you look up in PubMed, if you, tried to find that exact type of treatment, you won't find that many studies on it. So, what is your approach, and do you use progesterone on days 15 to 25 or?
So, physiologically, what's happening is normal. So we see, in luteal phase, this rise of progesterone, a little bit of surge in estrogen. And then a couple days before the cycle, they both come plummeting down. And there's physiologic effects of losing that estrogen and progesterone, and everything is going very low. So you're feeling that feeling of going from 60 to 0. Estrogen changes brain energy metabolism. It changes serotonin. The loss of progesterone, one of the metabolites of progesterone, works as a neurosteroid. So you start to feel this anxious feeling. So PMS and PMDD and things like that are real. Now, some women don't experience that, and some women do, right? But our brain chemistry and things like that are very different. There are things you can do to, help this, blood sugar control, because we know there's more instability in blood sugar. So kind of focusing on your diet, doing more low intensity exercise can be really helpful for some of those neurological changes, continuing to get good sleep. But the supplementation route, B vitamins can be helpful because they give the precursors to things like tryptophan and serotonin, or cofactors related to that. You need amino acids for that. Magnesium can be really helpful because this is a stressful point in the menstrual cycle. And I always think of magnesium as it gets burned out with stress. So the more stress you have, the more magnesium you need. So magnesium can be really helpful for both cramping, bleeding, and some of the mood disturbances. But progesterone, I do like micronized progesterone, and I will use it in luteal phase for some patients, a small amount taken at night. I don't like to use the synthetic progestins because there's some risks with those. But I
I
am a
do the
fan of,
same.
of
I
progesterone
get
for
them
some patients,
compounded.
especially in perimenopause, because what's happening in perimenopause is that you go through months where you're not ovulating. So they're losing progesterone certain months, and will sometimes have what we call these loop out of phase cycles that happen. So they'll get these like FSH, LH surges that aren't in the normal 28-day cycle. So these luteal out of phase events is kind of what they're called. And so I love progesterone and perimenopause for that reason. And then at some point, addition of estrogen.
Okay, that's really really helpful because it's information that I think a lot of people are not sharing, and probably just because a lot of practitioners don't prescribe progesterone to females on days 15 to 25. So I think that was really helpful. Thank you so much
Yeah, I
for
mean,
that.
it's kind of scary right now because we have this baby boomer population that's becoming menopausal, and menopause is hot right now. I mean, it's Oprah's talking about it, the celebrities are talking about it, and we have a lot of women coming into menopause right now, and we have a whole 20, 30, 40 years of providers that went through an era of training where hormone therapy was kind of shunned. And it's unfortunate. So there's a lot of patients out there who need help and a lot of practitioners that don't understand how to help them.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you. Like as soon as I started practicing, I started practicing HRT for women, and I got into it right away. I do use compounded creams. I don't use the traditional pharmaceuticals that are normally prescribed. So I use E2, E3, usually in a ratio of something like 30 to 70. So 30% E2, maybe 70% E3. And so you can probably explain this much better than me, but there are 3 different forms of estrogen. So,
Yep.
women's endocrinology is a lot more complicated than men's endocrinology. For men is basically just like, testosterone. Like you can get into some things like HCG and that kind of thing, but for the most part, a lot of men avoid that. When they're on HRT, it's essentially just testosterone. And like if
Yeah.
you have to use like Arimidex and that kind of thing, you're probably just taking too large of a dose. But in terms of women's health, what is your overall approach to menopausal women who come in with say
Well,
like vasomotor symptoms and sort of like the classic?
yeah, I mean, the traditional treatment for menopause was just treating vasomotor symptoms. So hot flashes and night sweats, essentially. If they have that, you don't even have to check their levels, just, give them some estrogen. If they have a uterus and you take estrogen, you have to take progesterone with it. So you cannot take estrogen only therapy if you have a uterus. And that's because you don't want to stimulate the endometrial lining postmenopausally. It does increase the risk of endometrial hyperplasia and uterine cancer. Okay. And that's just unopposed estrogen. So the body needs that balance if you have a uterus. So I'm a huge fan for hot flashes and night sweats because estrogen always makes it better. But there's a lot of other reasons to take estrogen. So with the loss of estrogen at menopause, we get hot flashes and night sweats. We get vaginal dryness. We get brain fog and memory dysfunction. We have an increased risk of cognitive decline and mild cognitive impairment. Our bones start demineralizing at a faster rate. We start losing our muscle at a faster rate. Estrogen is very anti-inflammatory. It literally changes gene transcription within the mitochondria, and these women become very insulin resistant. They start shuttling fat to the abdomen, and visceral fat starts getting stored around the organs and in the liver. And all of this is just kind of this, this culmination of all these little, events with loss of estrogen start to increase her risk of osteoporosis, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, dementia, all the things. And so it's not just about hot flashes and night sweats. There's a lot of things to think about with the loss of estrogen. And we're finally seeing the pendulum kind of swing that there is definitely benefit to giving women hormone replacement therapy in perimenopause through menopause and 10 years after menopause. And even 10 years after menopause, there's not an arbitrary reason to stop at age 65. It's a risk benefit, analysis of where is your current health? What are your current goals? I mean, for all I know, you could live to be 100 years old. I do have some older patients, even in their 80s, that are still on hormone replacement therapy. So it's a discussion that needs to be had at that time because there is also data that suggests that if you're 10 years past menopause, Yes, you could take it for hot flashes and night sweats, but because of the physiologic ramifications of that loss of estrogen, a lot of that can't be reversed. So it's much better at mitigating and slowing down those changes than it is. It's not going to reverse it. Now, with that said, I have seen a few patients come to me in their late 60s that we've initiated HRT, and they have had improvements in their DEXA scans, but they're on estrogen. They're also on testosterone. They're also my patient. So they're eating protein. They're on collagen. They're lifting weights. I mean, they're doing everything they can to try to rebuild that bone a little bit stronger. But like I said, if you're 10 years past menopause and you never initiated hormone therapy, there could be more risk involved of starting it later in life.
Okay. So essentially, what you want to do is as soon as you start having menopausal symptoms, you want to go see someone like yourself and then, get a good blood panel and then potentially get treated based upon your symptoms in your blood panel. And you're going to get
and
more
the
benefit.
caveat though, with the blood panel, because, and this is a question I get asked a lot on social media, so I want to spend a minute talking about it. In a woman who is not menopausal, she's still having intermittent periods. The hormones are changing hourly, daily, weekly, monthly. So when you're like throwing a dart at the board, like you don't know where it's going to land. So if you check it and it's the FSH is sky high and the estrogen's 12, okay, well, that's, good information. If you check it and the estradiol's 350 and the FSH is 6, okay, that might be good information too. The unfortunate part is you can't just come in and get a one-time lab draw and say like, oh, this is it. Because when patients come in and say, I want to get my hormones checked, that's a loaded ask.
Okay.
Because you can only look at estrogen in certain phases of the cycle. You can only look at progesterone in luteal phase. And so you have to know where they're at in their cycle. And if they're menstruating irregularly, right, their guess may be as good as mine. Now, if they don't have a uterus and you're trying to determine if they're menopausal, then lab testing can be helpful because if their FSH is over 25, 2 lab draws in a row and their estrogen's low and they've got hot flashes and, vaginal dryness, that's pretty clear cut. But you do have to understand that the clinical presentation and history are also very important here. You can't just come get, a lab draw because sometimes it's normal too. So you have to kind of take all of that, into consideration.
And one thing you mentioned earlier, and I do a little bit of this as well, and some women, are kind of surprised at this, but I do prescribe a small amount of testosterone for women who are menopausal, just like a 0.5% cream. It seems to be very effective for mostly for restoring their libido. So, a lot of people are unaware that, women actually gram for gram, and I'm sure you can speak about this more than I can, but gram for gram have more testosterone than estrogen. So it's very important for women to have a healthy amount of testosterone because that is where their sex drives comes from. So just like a man, when you replace testosterone, their sex drive goes up. Same thing for a woman, and it can be a drastic change, and it can also improve their motivation. It can improve their cognition. So there are multiple reasons for a woman to use testosterone, beyond just low libido.
Yeah, I mean, our estrogen is actually made from testosterone. So a lot of women don't realize that the ovary actually makes testosterone first and then locally converts it into estrogen. It also can get converted into estrogen through aromatase in the periphery. And so patients that have a lot of extra body fat, drinking lots of alcohol, this is something that can happen in both men and women, converting our androgens into estrogens. And it's a good thing, even for men. Men need estrogen too. But in women, testosterone replacement can be a good thing. It can help with sex drive. I find it's like 50-50. I think a lot of women want it to be like 100% and take testosterone and I have this like raging libido. But I think a lot of that is the misconception that most women have spontaneous desire and they don't. About 10% of women have spontaneous desire. About 90% do not. Now, men mostly have spontaneous desire. They wake up with a morning erection. They're like, I want to have sex today. And so there's this imbalance in, relationships where it's like, okay, well, he always wants to have sex and I don't feel like that every day. Is there something wrong with me? Women have what we call responsive desire or receptive arousal. So basically, like we need to be in that mood, that moment, right? Like the music's on, the dishes are done, the kids aren't bothering me. And then once they go into that headspace, then they like it. Once they get a little bit of, piques their interest, right? Then they enjoy it. So a lot of it is just breaking down the misconceptions with women. Yeah, no, like they need that, like, that stimulus first. And then once they get that stimulus, then they want it. And now they have desire. But unfortunately, once they go through menopause and they get vaginal dryness and it hurts to have intercourse and they've lost their hormones and, and then they're not investing the time into that space. And for so many couples too, and I've talked about this on numerous podcasts, for a majority of couples, the tick count on the piece of paper is how many times they've had sex, and sexual relationships are so much more than just penetrative intercourse. And so a lot of women just don't understand that there's other ways to receive sexual pleasure. And so, but women, yes, I think testosterone, the caveat is that you must have a practitioner that understands that over replacing testosterone has major consequences. And I see a lot of women get overdosed very easily. And there can be non-reversible ramifications of that.
And the consequences of that would be they obviously can get hirsutism. So that would be hair on the face. And then also
acne, dark hair growth, clitoromegaly.
Clitoromegaly is the one that's not reversible, right?
I do see some reversibility, but yes, it can be non-reversible in some situations, depending how long they've been over replaced physiologically. Think about this. This is just like if a female child wanted to transition into a boy, we just blast them with testosterone. They can actually grow like a phallic structure from the clitoris. So you get widening of the jaw, deepening of the voice. All things that make men, right? There's a reason we have 10 to 30 times less testosterone. Okay. More isn't always better, but a small physiologic amount can have a lot of benefits.
Yeah, I totally agree. One thing you mentioned earlier or a few minutes ago is you said visceral fat. And I know that you actually posted about this recently, how, you got a DEXA scan done. So this is important because I don't think it's talked about, enough. So visceral fat is, fat around our organs. So can you explain to everyone why you did that DEXA scan, why you did that the DEXA scan, and why visceral fat is so important?
Yeah. So we obsess about subcutaneous fat. We obsess about the fat right now. Everybody take your hand. You can pinch your stomach, right? That is subcutaneous fat. That's what we obsess about when we look in the mirror naked. That kind of fat isn't always a bad thing. It insulates us. It's an endocrine organ. Now, right, we have an unlimited storage capacity. So some people have way too much. Okay. But visceral fat, I don't care if you look fat or skinny from the outside. Visceral fat is a problem for everybody, particularly Indian Asian communities, because they don't look physically obese, but they can carry a ton of visceral fat. And visceral fat is metabolic disease. It's the fat that is in the liver, around the organs, and it's very dangerous. So the only way to measure that, now we have proxies, right? We use things like BMI, waist circumference. We try to use some proxies in medicine, but nobody is directly measuring visceral fat. The best way to measure it is you can do a rough estimate via things like in-body bioelectrical impedance. You can get DEXA scans, CTs, or MRIs. Those are the most accurate as a cadaver dissection, but I don't want to kill you just to find out how much visceral fat you have.
And Bob don't do it, correct?
I'm not as familiar with actually I did a lot of bod pods in college. That's what the University of Nebraska had, but I don't think that's as effective for visceral fat measurement. Yeah.
But go ahead.
So the reason that it's so important is because there are people that don't have a lot of subcutaneous fat, or maybe they're a normal BMI or normal waist circumference, and they have a ton of visceral fat. So here's the deal. I have this presentation slide that I use in tons of lectures, and it shows the difference with an MRI of a patient. They have the same waist circumference, and it's actually a normal waist circumference by all standards in medicine. And one has a ton of visceral fat and the other one has a tiny amount. And then same thing, I have another slide that looks at just BMI. The patients both have a BMI of 25. One has a ton of visceral fat and the other one doesn't. So if you're not looking for it, you're not going to know if it's there or not. And visceral fat is highly correlated with mortality. It is an independent risk factor for your death. So it's related to your diet. It's related to your poor sleep. It's related to your alcohol use. It's related to your lack of exercise and how much lean body mass you're carrying. There's some genetic disposition, but the vast majority of it is lifestyle. And if you're just going to pick one biomarker that predicts your risk, visceral fat is a big one.
And so when you say visceral fat, is linked to all-cause mortality, what is it like? What are the things that it's increasing? Is it cardiovascular disease? Is it stroke? Is it cancer? Like, what is it exactly when you say it increases your risk of all-cause mortality?
So the two most things to kill you, right? Well,
Yeah.
let's say three. The three most likely things to kill anybody listening to this podcast right now are heart disease, which that includes heart attack, stroke, whatever. And honestly, I put diabetes in there because that's what causes cardiovascular disease, insulin resistance, um, cancer, and neurologic diseases. So Alzheimer's, cognitive incline, dementia, you name it. Those are the three things of everybody listening to this podcast that is most likely to kill them. All three of those are related to visceral fat.
Wow. I knew that it was related to cardiovascular disease, but I actually didn't know about the cancer or the neurodegenerative diseases. So that's very interesting. So if you have more visceral fat, like you could potentially
Well,
be
there's
more
other pathways. So there's
like
other
Alzheimer's.
pathways. There's other pathways to Alzheimer's. There's other pathways to cancer, right? Maybe
Right.
people carry a BRCA gene or something like that. But here's the deal is visceral fat is an inflammation bomb. It drives inflammation. It presses the on button of the NLRP3 inflammasome, right? This little protein that basically causes this like quote unquote inflammation. And when you are pouring kerosene on the fire, it's hard to keep the fire controlled. And so that's unfortunately what visceral fat is. It's a burning dumpster fire inside your belly, right around your organs. And whatever you're susceptible to, it is just going to tip the teeter-totter.
So you mentioned earlier that someone can have low amount of subcutaneous fat so they can look great in the mirror naked, but they can have a ton of visceral fat. So
Yeah.
but I also heard you say that lifestyle is basically the biggest thing to decrease visceral fat. So are there specific things that you can do to decrease your visceral fat that don't affect your subcutaneous fat? Because it seems like the same things that you would do to decrease your subcutaneous fat would be the same things to decrease your visceral fat. Like, am I missing something there?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, let me give an example.
Okay.
The ketogenic diet, everybody thinks the ketogenic diet is about weight loss. Okay. There's a lot of ways to lose weight. You can go on a calorie restricted goldfish diet and lose weight. A lot of ways to lose weight. But metabolic health, restoring insulin sensitivity, decreasing inflammation, ketones work through cellular signaling pathways, and they do a lot of amazing things. So you could be a little bit overweight with a ton of visceral fat, initiate a ketogenic diet, not really lose a pound on the scale, and reduce your visceral fat. Okay. So, yes, losing 100 pounds and losing some subcutaneous fat, the visceral fat almost always improves. But with that said, you can reduce visceral fat by not losing weight and not losing subcutaneous fat. Visceral fat is your metabolic health. So, if you don't have weight to lose, maybe you're a good body fat percentage, but you drink a lot of beer and you don't get a lot of sleep and you've still got a lot of visceral fat and your testosterone's low or whatever it is, you can still improve those things. You can still improve your visceral fat. What's been interesting for me tracking it is that I've always had a quote unquote normal visceral fat since the first time I measured it, because I never measured it when I was like diabetic and hypothyroid. But I did a bodybuilding competition this last year. And as I got ridiculously lean, I got a ridiculously low amount of visceral fat. I mean, I joked with my husband, like, don't punch me in the stomach. You're going to like break my spleen. I mean, I had nothing in there. But as I've regained the weight and I'm back to almost a starting weight that I was before I did the bodybuilding competition, my visceral fat has never come back up. It's stayed extremely low. So it's interesting that, you could really kind of like, go on this pathway of, dialing in nutrition, dialing in sleep, all these things. And I still regained a lot of my subcutaneous fat, but my visceral fat stayed the same.
That's
So
interesting. Someone needs to
yeah.
do a study on bodybuilders on this. That would be very, very
Well, but
interesting.
here's the thing. If you don't follow Dr. Sean Amaro, you should. And he has some interesting theories because traditional bodybuilders eat a lot of carbohydrates, right? They might be eating like
That's true.
400,
That's
500.
true.
And
Right.
you see these bodybuilders that have kind of this like turtle shell abdomen, or you actually see CrossFitters that have it too. And right, people think maybe they have a thick waist just because they have such large lean body mass. But his theory
Or
is
HGH.
actually the amount of, whether it's hormones, steroids or stuff that they're using, but it could be the high carb, low fat approach increases visceral fat. And so I'd love for somebody to look at it, but that's kind of the thing too, is right. They look lean and they look healthy, but maybe they're not, right? Maybe they're
Mhm.
not. And so I just think it's important to get tested and find out how much visceral fat you have. I've seen some patients with very surprising results.
That's very interesting. Okay, so this is actually a good time to maybe chat about statins because we were just chatting about visceral fat and how it increases the risk of cardiovascular disease, which is by far the number one killer in North America. So I have a very cautious approach to statins, and I'm still researching it myself. I haven't really even come to a conclusion yet, and because I'm in this big dilemma. So the dilemma is, I have people like Kyle Gillette, Kevin Bass, who've both been on my podcast before, and then Dr. Peter Attia wrote a book on longevity where he talks about decreasing statins. So and Lane Norton as well, one of the best nutritionists in the world. He takes a statin himself. And then when you look at the Mendelian randomization trials, it shows that lower LDL is helpful, is associated with better outcomes. But here's where my dilemma comes in. When you look at the interventions, which are statins and easytral, they always show that they can lower LDL, but they never actually show any benefit in decreasing mortality or cardiovascular disease.
Mm-hmm.
So it's super strange. Like I have these, amazing physicians and nutritionists that I, think are awesome, who are all taking, statins or PCSK9 inhibitors, which is a very strong lipid lowering drug. And, there's Mendelian randomization trials to back up what they're saying. But the intervention, like what we actually do, doesn't seem to decrease their mortality. And so for me, it's like, it's hard to justify, putting someone on a statin because I feel like, yeah, I'm going to lower your LDL, but I don't know if I'm actually going to decrease your risk of cardiovascular disease.
Yeah. I'm probably team less statins. And I'll tell you why. They're broadly recommended, right? For a lot of different reasons, but the people that they really help are the people who have had an event, the people who have had a stroke, had an MI. They work through an anti-inflammatory pathway to stabilize plaques in the arteries. So people who have had an event, there may be some benefit, but for people who haven't, there are ramifications. Like I said, with birth control pills, with statins, there's ramifications. They can deplete CoQ10. They can increase insulin resistance and diabetes. There's always a trade-off. So to think that there's, some miracle as far as, longevity, the biohackers will try anything at any cost. But I think they're oversold. I think there are a lot of things we don't understand about cardiovascular disease. And I'm very excited though, because if you follow the ketogenic literature, there's a guy named Dave Feldman who used to be an engineer, and he has crowdfunded some randomized research that's happening right now. And I don't want to get ahead of myself. I don't want to steal Dave's thunder, but they're looking at patients with super high LDL levels, but normal, good HDL levels and low triglycerides, right? Because this is always the question is it LDL? Is it LDL we should be focusing on? Yes, these drugs drive down LDL, but like, does that help outcomes, right? Does that make us live longer and not have a heart attack? So he is looking at this, and what he is finding is that on low carb diets, and these are higher fat diets, right? And fat is supposed to cause heart disease. And these patients have sky high LDL, is that he can't find coronary disease in these patients. And so I think that we don't know the entire story, when it comes to what role LDL, truly plays. And just like most things too, having a really low LDL, how too low of an LDL is also a problem, right? And the vast majority of people that die with heart attacks die with a normal LDL level. So I think there's just so much of the story that we don't understand. But at this current time, I'm cautious with, which patients, we talk about statin therapy. And I'm seeing younger and younger female patients being recommended to be on them. And these are people who are in their years of fertility. So I think that's very dangerous too. But I would say for those reasons, I use statins a lot less.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned a couple of things there. There's two ones that really stand out to me. Like, there was a study I saw recently where statins actually increase your risk of diabetes by 3 times.
Yeah.
Like that's
my own mother has been on statins for like 40 plus years, and she has bad heart disease despite being on 40 years of statins. And now she's a diabetic.
Yeah.
And I just,
And the second thing I was going to mention is it depletes you of CoQ10. which can, deplete your energy and really make you feel awful.
They're
And
really toxic to the mitochondria.
yeah, it's like, and everyone wants to, like, mitochondrial health is a big thing right now. Like people are taking a lot of supplements for it, like, PQQ and all these other things.
Hmm.
And, to take something like a statin to sort of like, I don't want to say destroy it, but it would definitely would hinder it, especially if you're taking a high dose. Like it's just something that I know it's like in the guidelines and every doctor is supposed to like, prescribe and use the Framingham risk score and all that. But, it doesn't really add up in a lot of ways. And actually, if you look at the Framingham study, it seemed like the people who had higher cholesterol actually lived longer than the people who had lower cholesterol. And that's the same study that I learned in medical school and going through residency was like, anyone comes in, uses this Framingham risk score, plug in the numbers, and if it pops out that they need a statin, prescribe it.
Yep.
But it's it's something that I'm definitely still not comfortable with at all. And then people will say, okay, just look at their ApoB. And I understand that, ApoB is probably a better lipid marker than LDL, but I've yet to see a patient with like, sky high LDL and then super low ApoB. I mean, maybe they exist out there, but I haven't seen, too many people have, that data on their blood work.
Yeah, well, the ApoB is found on LDL, so it makes sense. But there's other markers, LPA,
LP little a,
PLA2 activity. I mean, I think there's other markers that we're starting to look at and use. But we have to like use our brains, right? Like,
yeah,
what's their visceral fat? What's their fasting glucose level? Do they have hypertension? Do they have, right? Do the
yeah,
Peter Attias of the world really need statins? How much longer is it going to make them live? When you're
yeah,
doing all those other things. But for people that aren't, for people that are just a total dumpster fire, maybe there's some benefit. But I think you
yeah,
got to fix. I mean, where I come from. You got to fix the
yes,
you got to fix the fixables.
absolutely. And
Otherwise, like not much is really going to help.
yeah, and this is a perfect time too to talk about your 5 pillars of health, because I know we only have about 10 minutes left. So, how did you develop this, and why did you develop it?
Yeah. So I wrote a book called Hard to Kill last year. And it's really, it's the story that I've told on this podcast, of being a doctor, having these degrees, having all these problems, and then just realizing that medicine is not helping anyone. Like I always tell people, like nobody's coming to save you. And the solution to the healthcare crisis is that we each start to take individual accountability for our health. And then once we do that, then our families, right? We change it within inside the walls of our own home. And Hard to Kill is built on 5 pillars. And they're kind of what I believe are the foundational principles of how we should live our life. And if we do that, we probably don't need Western medicine as much as we're trying to utilize it right now. And the first pillar is nutrition. What we eat influences everything. In our bodies, we have nutrient sensing pathways. It sets the pace of our fertility. It sets the pace of our aging. And it's something we do every day, multiple times per day. And nutrition is just so important. The second one is exercise. We're overprescribed cardio. We're not promoting weightlifting as much. We need to do that. We also just need to move our bodies. We were designed to do physically difficult things. And we've become such a lazy, sedentary society because we can literally pick up our phone and we can order Uber Eats to our house. We don't even have to cook for ourselves anymore. The third one is sleep, something that's not talked about. Our airway, our breathing, our oral microbiome, what happens in sleep with production of hormones and autophagy and things like that are so important. And people just live in, it's a fast paced world, right? I'll sleep when I'm dead. Like people just don't realize the impact that has.
The Gary
The
Vee kind
last,
of effect.
yeah, yeah. The fourth one is creating resiliency from stress, emotional, physical, spiritual stress, like understanding the mindset that's involved with like being grateful and living, an amazing life. For me, I lost my best friend at the age of 29. She was just like swept off this earth. And I don't take any day for granted. I just don't know. Every single day I see it in medicine. And we become kind of immune to our own mortality, but it's real. You just don't know.
Yeah,
So, you wake up every day just being damn grateful that you have another opportunity. And we do live stressful lives, right? But stress is a good thing. Stress like builds us stronger. And, so you have to figure out how to have some resiliency. But you can't be overtraining. You can't be, in bad relationships and things like that. And then the last pillar is environment. It seems kind of like a catch-all, but it is basically the people, places, and things that we interact with. So like where we live in the world, like our water supply, air quality, these things have a big difference. People, your circle, the people you hang out with, the people you work with, the people you're married to, they have a huge impact on your health. And then things is like all the cosmetics and the plastic water bottles and just like all the things you don't think about that impact our health. So those are kind of like the 5 pillars, and it's very simple. The book is written in a way that like my 10-year-old kid could understand it. And at the end, there's like a 30-day challenge of just trying to like start to change little things in your life, because I hope that if I can inspire people start making these changes for themselves, that medicine can get back to focusing on what we really want to focus on, right? Which is new, amazing discoveries. Instead, we are like running on this hamster wheel of metabolic disease.
Yeah, I think, we're not focusing on the lifestyle interventions as much as we should. But one thing I wanted to ask you about there was, so with regards to like cardio and strength training, is there a specific sort of ratio that you recommend? Like, is it like 1-to-1 or maybe 2-to-1 strength training to cardio? And like when you do cardio, what do you actually do?
Well, if you lift weights, hard, it is a cardiovascular workout. So for people to kind of like separate them, it's like, well, lifting weights is cardio, right? But running on the treadmill, when I was training for half marathons, for instance, you can run long periods of time. And unfortunately, you know what you're doing? You're stressing out your body. You're ramping up your cortisol after, you've been running for 45, 60 minutes. It's really hard on your joints. So a vast majority of people are doing so much cardio that they're hurting their results, right? It's not a good, effective way to build lean body mass. It doesn't. And in fact, it probably hurts your lean body mass. So for me, foundationally, be lifting 3 to 4 to 5 times per week, progressive overload, more reps, more weights over time. I'm not saying cardio is not a good thing. I think it's great. Some zone 2 cardio, here and there. I do it kind of on my days that I'm not lifting,
And zone 2
because
is
it
60
just,
to 70% of your heart rate, correct?
yeah, yeah, yeah. And then I think you should add some high intensity, I'm talking like sprint training. But what people need to understand, we're talking like a 3-minute workout. We're talking like at the end of your lifting session, like get on a bike, get on a rower, get on a whatever. And I'm talking everything you have, whether for 8 rounds, 20 seconds on, 20 seconds off, it doesn't take very long. But sprinting is important because as we age, we lose our fast twitch muscle fibers. And it is the reason why grandma is shuffling across the kitchen. It's why she's going to fall and break a hip. It's why so you're not going to get that from your zone 2 cardio. You're going to get it a little bit from your lifting if you're doing more explosive movements and things like that. But I think it's important, 1 to 2 times per week to incorporate some sprint training too.
Okay, so sprint training, you would recommend that for cardio then over, say, just traditional like running on the treadmill. And then
I currently don't do any extra cardio. I currently lift 4 days a week and do some sprint training.
And when you do sprint training, like what you described is pretty close to Tabatas. I think Tabatas are 20 seconds on, 10
Like
seconds
true
off.
Tabata. Most
Yeah.
people think they're doing a HIIT workout and they're not. They're doing an hour-long zone, 2-3 cardio.
Okay. And then so yeah, 20 seconds on, I think 10 seconds off. I think that's a traditional Tabata that takes 4
Yep.
minutes. Where you do 20 seconds on, 20
Yeah,
seconds.
I'll change it up, but I
Okay.
typically do like 8 rounds and I pick what it's going to be. I have a great hill in my neighborhood. I like to go sprint up the hill, walk down the hill, sprint up the hill, walk down the hill. Or if you're in a gym and you have, a rower, elliptical, a treadmill, whatever it is, just pick the interval. The rest should be equal or less than the work time. And it sucks. I mean, I'm talking like this is full out exertion. But this is an excellent way to reduce visceral fat. It's an excellent way to increase resiliency, and it does not take very much time.
Amazing. Okay. I know we only have a couple minutes left. So, where can people find you online? Where can they learn more about your book, Hard to Kill? And where can they learn more about you?
Yeah, you can find me. I'm most active on Instagram at Dr. Fit and Fabulous. My website is drfitandfabulous.com. I'll invite anybody that's listening. We have a summit, Hard to Kill Summit, last week of July here in Omaha, Nebraska, and we have some incredible speakers coming in. Gabrielle Lyon, Dr. Jay Quish, Sean
Wow.
O'Mara. It's going to be really good. So if
Gabrielle
you
Lyon's
want
awesome.
to learn more about everything we talked about, you guys should come check it out.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. You taught me a lot today. I think a lot of the listeners learned a lot too. So thank you so much again. And for everyone listening, I'll be back again next week.